Hi, my name is Delaney Shannon, and today we'll be focusing on the rise of women in American politics. Dating back to the creation of the United States, we have seen a primarily male-dominated government system. The creation of the Declaration of Independence was responsible for setting the scene. The document was written in 1776 and was used as a way to formally address the split that was occurring between the colonists and the British Empire. The document presented the idea that men had the right to choose the government system they believed best served them and the freedoms of others. This idea worked off of philosopher John Locke, who believed that all men are equal and have certain unalienable rights. The committee who wrote the Declaration of Independence was made up of 5 men who are on the screen. No women were directly involved in the creation of this document, which is disappointing when you consider the depths of the document and the impact it still has on our country today. Abigail Adams, wife of first Vice President John Adams, made sure to remind the Founding Fathers the importance of women in society. In a letter addressed to her husband, Abigail tells him and the other founding members to remember the ladies. She is essentially letting them know that women's voice matters and will not go unheard, and that representation of women is important. Even though it would take some time, Abigail's words would soon become true, and eventually we would begin to not only see women fighting for their right to vote, but also women fighting for the representation in the American political system. And up on the screen is a copy of her letter. Although women being excluded from the creation of the Declaration of Independence was disappointing, it was not the last time we would see a lack of integration in developing historical documents. 11 years after the Declaration of Independence was created, the ratification of the Constitution occurred. The Constitution is arguably one of the most important documents created, since it sets up the framework and operation of the American government system. It is important to note that once again, we only see white male, most of whom were lawyers, involved in the creation of this document, making it no surprise the only people who originally were given the right to vote under the Constitution were white men who owned property. This ultimately resulted in major setbacks for women that would make it seem almost impossible at the time for women to have their voice heard. It would take almost 60 years after the creation of the Constitution for women to finally band together and demand the rights they believed they had. This event is formally known as the First Women's Rights Convention. It took place at Westlands Methodist Church in Seneca Falls in New York State on July of 1848. There's a picture of the church on the screen. The convention was used to discuss the social, religious, and civil opportunities women deserve. The event was 2 days long and had approximately 200 to 300 women in attendance. The first day was exclusive to only female, but men were allowed the second day. The convention discussed many things, and at the end of it, they even produced their own declaration of rights and sentiments they believed women had. One thing that was included in this declaration was women's right to hold political office. 18 years after the Women's Rights Convention occurred in Seneca Falls, we see the first woman attempt to step out onto the political field. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, an organizer of the Women's Rights Convention, attempted to win a position in the House of Representatives in 1866. She ran as an independent in the state of New York, which is where she was originally from, and she ultimately ended up losing the election, only gaining 24 of the 12,000 votes casted. Although this is a very small number, it is important to keep in mind that no women were able to cast their votes at this time. Whether Stanton knew it or not, she had just opened a new door of opportunities for all American women. Finally, in 1887, 39 years after Elizabeth Cady Stanton ran for federal office, the first woman in American history was finally seen securing a spot in political office. Susan Salter ran unintentionally for mayor in Organa, Kansas, on the Prohibition ticket. Allegedly, former men in her city nominated her as a joke without her knowledge. They believed that women did not have any chance of winning, and it is also important to note that at the time of her campaign taking place, Kansas had just passed a law that gave women the right to vote in municipal elections. This means that they could vote in city elections, but not state or federal. This is one of the major factors that definitely contributed to her win. Although she did not win any federal or state position, being elected mayor this early on in American history is quite impressive, especially when you consider it was a joke. After Salter's victory, we began to see a continuous spike upwards as more and more women were becoming interested in politics. In 1892, the first woman in American history would become victorious in winning a statewide election. This victory took place in North Dakota when Laura Eisenhower ran for the public school position of superintendent. Eisenhower was endorsed by two parties at the time known as the Democratic and Populist. At the time of her campaign, North Dakota women were only allowed to vote upon school-related political matters. Laura ran against the current male Republican candidate, Joseph M. Devine, and beat him by very small margins. She ran again in 1894, but was unsuccessful in winning. Eisenhower became another great example that women were just as competent as men to hold political positions. It would not be until 1916 that we would officially see the first woman to hold federal office in the United States. Jeannette Rankin ran for the House of Representatives in Montana and won. Montana was the 9th state to give women the right to vote. Rankin herself was known by many prior to running due to the fact that she would travel across the country to speak about the rights she believed women should have. These aspects helped her career immensely since many women at the time were very advocate about getting the right to vote. After her victory in 1916, she decided to run for U.S. Senator. However, she ended up shorthanded and was unsuccessful in winning the campaign. Overall, Jeannette's success was incredible, seeing as she became the first woman to hold an office in Congress that had been dominated by men since the country's creation. On August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment officially became part of the United States Constitution. This granted all women the right to vote. This right to vote finally gave women a voice and allowed them to make a bigger impact on the way politics were being run. Although it would take some time to fully integrate women into the political scene, this was a huge victory. One issue that arose with this amendment is the fact that it did nothing to change the excessive requirements many Jim Crow states had in place to prevent people of color from voting. These requirements included things such as literacy tests, poll tests, and etc. Ultimately, resulted in many setbacks. It made it much more difficult for women of color to rise on the political scene. It would take approximately 45 more years until women of color were finally given the right to vote. After the 19th Amendment was adopted, women slowly became more popular in the political field. Just 5 years after it passed, the country would officially have its first woman governor. Nellie Rose was the governor of Wyoming from 1925 to 1927. Wyoming was the first state in our nation to allow women the right to vote. Nellie took office after her husband had recently passed away. She served 2 years. This was a huge milestone in the rise of women in American politics, since being governor is one of the highest political honors you can hold within a state. They are in charge of implementing many laws and overseeing the operation of the state's executive branch. In 1931, Harriet White Carraway became the first woman elected to the Senate in the United States. She was originally appointed the role after her husband Thaddeus died in office. She served 1 year before running for re-election in the state of Arkansas and was successful in gaining a win. This officially made her the first woman to ever be elected to the Senate in the United States. In 1943, She officially became the first woman to ever preside over the Senate, meaning she was in charge of maintaining orders within the discussion, which is a very high diplomatic role to have. It is clear that she deserved it and was responsible for breaking many barriers that would not have been breakable. In 1933, we continue to see the expansion in new roles women in politics fields were able to fill when Frances Perkins officially became the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet. She was appointed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt as the U.S. Secretary of Labor in 1933. The U.S. Secretary of Labor is in charge of making sure federal wages are fair, along with a long multitude of other things. Much of the work that occurred while Perkins was a member of the cabinet has had a long-lasting effect on our society. In 1981, we finally see the first woman nominated and appointed to the Supreme Court. As many may already know, the Supreme Court is the highest court in our nation and responsible for dealing with the cases that involve treaties and all other issues dealing with the Constitution. Sandra Day O'Connell was nominated by former Republican President Ronald Reagan and was confirmed by the U.S. Senate by a mass majority. During this time she served on the court, she was very much considered a swing vote, and she served almost a total of 25 years. She is 1 out of 5 women who have ever served this position. 1984 was a very pivotal moment for American women. Former Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro became the first woman to ever be selected as a vice president candidate on a major party ticket. She served as Walter Monday's running mate in the election as part of the Democratic Party. The two were running against Ronald Reagan and ended up being unsuccessful in the campaign. Even with this loss, Ferraro became an inspiration. Up until this point, the role of vice president had always felt like a very male-dominated thing. In the year 2016, we finally had our first woman presidential candidate for a major political party. Hillary Clinton, who was already a well-established politician, attempted to beat newcomer Donald Trump in the 2016 general election. In the end, she was unsuccessful and ended up winning the popular vote but losing the electoral vote. Although many were disappointed about the loss due to the fact that she was the first woman to ever come this close to being president, it is important to remember all the obstacles women have overcome since the creation of this country and how only 94 years earlier, when this campaign took place, women were not allowed to vote. So what's happening now? Before wrapping up the discussion of women's rise in American politics, it is important to look at the major turning points that have happened just this year. President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence ran once again in the general election in an attempt to stay in office. They ran against past Vice President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris candidate who Joe Biden picks. Kamala Harris was the first woman of color to run for vice president on a large party ballot. There has currently been a clear projection that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have won the election, and both will be sworn in on January 20th, 2001. If this is true, Kamala Harris will become the first woman and woman of color to ever hold this position. It is clear Abigail Adams was right when she told her husband and other founding father members to remember the ladies. Here's my works cited page. All the highlighted ones are the JSTOR ones, just so you have an easier time seeing them.